Yeah, welcome everybody to our webinar of the Sino-German Center at Frankfurt School today. Welcome, good morning in Europe and Germany, and good afternoon in Asia and China. A special welcome to our two speakers, Professor Ben Shenglin from the Zhejiang University International Business School and Professor Klaus Mühlhahn from the China Institute of China Study of the Freie Universität Berlin. We have still some small technical issues in the sense that Professor Ben still looking how he comes to the screen, but we can hear it, and maybe he can fix the issue in the next minutes. Yeah, from my side, again, welcome very much. As you know the topic. We want to discuss China's new 15 5-year plan, which was just decided by the National People's Congress, the highest legislative body of the People's Republic of China. And of course, we want especially discuss the impact for the economy and business. Before I hand over to the speakers, let me point out some issues which have been discussed. From my point of view, I found especially interesting the speech by Premier Li, because he stressed on the one side the resilience of China's economy in the last year, but also touched on certain issues, for example, in his own words, the strong supply and the weaker demand, but also on other issues like the debt burden of local governments, and of course also the international challenges and internally in China, the protectionism between different provinces. Most of you know he announced a growth goal lower than last year, between last year's 4.5 to 5%. This is probably from the pure figure not so much important, but the important point is that China has the goal to double until 2035 the GDP per capita compared to 2020, and for that they need at least a growth rate of 4% to reach this goal. Yeah, having said that, I think for us is most important three questions. First, what are the main content of the new 5-year plan? Secondly, do we think that this plan is appropriate to drive further on China on a sustainable growth path, overcoming the mentioned and other issues, and also, of course, the external pressures? And last but not least, especially from a German-European perspective, from a foreign perspective, what does it mean for foreign business? Is this more a challenge or are more opportunities here? Yeah, having said that, I hand over now to Professor Ben Shenglin. I already mentioned Professor Ben is Professor and Dean at the Zhejiang University International Business School in Hangzhou, and also Dean of the Academy of Internet Finance in Zhejiang University. He spent many years, 2 decades actually, with International Bank. At latest, he was the CEO of JP Morgan Chase Bank in China. Shenglin has a bachelor degree in engineering from Zhejiang University, a master degree in management from Renmin University, and a PhD in economics from Purdue University in the United States. So Ben, although we can't see you, but we can hear you, that is, I think, the most important. So I suggest you start with your introduction right now, and after that I hand over to Professor Mühlhahn. I think all participants know our procedure, which is pretty much straightforward. We have 2 introductory statements, and then you are most happy to issue questions to the speakers in our following Q&A session. Yeah, once again, welcome to all of you. Ben, are you ready? Please go ahead.
Thank you, host and Klaus. Good morning to all of you in Europe, and probably I apologize for somehow you couldn't see me. Maybe because it's now 6 p.m. in China, we are switching off from a video perspective to in terms of working. But jokes aside, and I think thank you for inviting me to talk about the 15th five-year plan and what's the implication for the global business and the Chinese economy. First of all, I will use 3 C's to characterize the 15th five-year plan. The first C is obviously the very, very Chinese, because the first 14 five-year plans have proved to be pretty effective in guiding China's growth in various areas as well. Okay, so that and specifically this year, the C talked about the Chinese style, Chinese characteristics in terms of modernization. That means the development path that China wants to pursue. So that one is very, very Chinese, and also it takes us to the not just this next 5 years, but also the year 2035, basically the 16th five-year plan. And there was some kind of projected, I would say vision about where the China would like to be. So that's the first C. The second C is comprehensive. Just like many other, so-called like five-year plans, it's very comprehensive. It covers from agriculture to technology to education to finance to national security. Basically, it's very, very comprehensive. It covers almost how China would like to, pursue its goals in the next 5 years. How we want to interact with the rest of the world. How the foreign companies may be able to work with China and working in China and so on and so forth. So it's very, very comprehensive. And the third C, I would say, is consistency and continuity. Meaning like it's not a brand new one. It's built on what we have done, especially over the 14th five-year plan, which ended basically last year. So 3 months ago, we ended the 14th five-year plan. And the beginning of this year, it's the beginning of the new five-year plan. So it's very much continuous and consistency. And but of course, there are some differentiation or changes, differences. First and foremost, for example, the emphasis on technology is extraordinary because China wants to pursue technological independence and autonomy in many ways. So, and particularly AI and smart China, so-called digital China strategy is very prominent. And secondly is the industrial systems, especially the manufacturing comes very prominently for the throughout, so-called like the five-year plan. And then of course, the opening up. That means high quality, we call high quality opening up to the rest of the world. That comes probably to some surprise to many people outside China. They thought because of the geopolitical situation, China may be turning inward. On the contrary, compared to the 14th five-year plan, the emphasis on high quality opening door policy has moved up in terms of prominence. Okay? The other thing is also getting more prominence in terms of like mention and coverage is the demographic challenge. As many of you know, China's population started declining basically in about 2 to 3 years ago. So that's a challenge for China. And the 15th five-year plan has set aside a special chapter focusing on the birth rates, the aging situation, and so on and so forth. So that's very, very much some of the differences. As you mentioned also in terms of the quality versus quantity, this year the first time that we have kind of like targeting like below 5% GDP growth. So we're talking about 4.5 to 5. So that's a shift in terms of the focusing from quantity to quality growth. And secondly is about really the internal market. Given the geopolitical situation, China wants to develop further an entirely integrated domestic market so that it can counter some of the impact of the slowing export market. Even though China has been doing pretty well in terms of export. For example, last year, it's a record. And the first 2 months of this year, the export has been doing very well as well. And the other thing is very important is that green, that means sustainable growth. China has been doing pretty well in terms of like new energy, so-called electric vehicles, and so on and so forth. That part, despite some of the countries which may be walking back from their commitments, previous commitments to the green development, sustainable development, but China has put green development at the center of this and reiterates our previous commitment to the decarbonization and so on and so forth. So that part is very, 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 very significant. And of course, what has not been mentioned prominently though, in terms of coverage, is actually finance. If you look at the whole finance, there is only one section within the chapter 18. Totally, there are many chapters talking about China wants to develop or build a so-called financial superpower, a strong finance nation as well. And that part, it's a reiteration of what China was already saying in the 14th five-year plan. Specifically, by a strong finance nation, it covers the central currency, central banking, for example, that's the C, what I call CRED. The second one is regulation. Regulation has to be really good at the regulatory capacity, building up that. And the third one is institution. That means the Chinese banks, Chinese insurance companies, the VC companies, and they have to be really strong, including, say like a stock exchange in a sense. The T, what I call is talent, and of course, technology. And then the other one is really the infrastructure, building up the digital infrastructure, the regulatory infrastructure, technology infrastructure for the finance. So finally, it's building up Shanghai as an international financial center. So specifically, the 6 pillars of the so-called strong nation of finance is called critique, what I call. Currency, central banking, regulatory capacity, institutions, talent and technology, infrastructure, and the center of finance. Finally, China has been emphasizing a lot that the finance and everything else needs to focus on real economy. The real economy, real needs of the economy, and the manufacturing side especially. So for that part, China has reiterated the 5 plans, 5 areas. One is what we call technology financing in support of the technological independence. The second one is inclusive finance, which we know that China is doing pretty well in that area. The third is what we call green finance, as I mentioned, to support the green transition. The fourth one is what I call e-financing. That means like digital financing, e-commerce financing, and so on and so forth. China wants to develop the digital economy, and e-commerce, e-finance is a pillar to support that. And the final area is what we call retirement finance. Because of the aging population, that the people needs better financial services to support their retirement and pensions and so on and so forth. That 5 areas, what I call TIGER, 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 technology financing, inclusive finance, green finance, e-financing or digital financing, and then retirement finance. So finally, the implications for everybody is that, first of all, I would say, as I mentioned earlier, we are focusing a lot more on the quality instead of quantity in terms of growth rate. We focus a lot more on the real economy, on the manufacturing side in particular. We focus a lot more on the innovative part, the AIs, the digital China strategy, we focus a lot more on the economic security, technology security. That means the supply chain side. And that part is becoming very, very important. And finally, you will see a lot more opening up in China. That means the opening up is not just about the inbound, foreign companies, European companies coming to China for market, for product development, for manufacturing, but also it's the outbound. That means the Chinese companies are not just making products for the rest of the world to a certain extent, but also they are becoming a lot more innovative. So that means China, as I said, is trying to develop, spend more money in terms of like R&D, research and development. For example, in a city like Shanghai, we're talking about 7% of the GDP probably would be deployed for research and development. That means China will become a center of innovation. That means foreign companies would not just manufacture things in China, but also co-create and innovate things in China. China is already a leader in AI, in humanoid robotics, in healthcare technology, fintech, new energy, integrated circuit, logistics, shipbuilding, aerospace, deep sea technology, and so on and so forth. So I think China will increasingly become a center of not just manufacturing, center of so-called product, but also center of innovation. And I think that's a great opportunity for all of us. So I will stop here, host. Okay.
For the excellent speech, Shenglin. I hand over now to Klaus Mühlhahn. Klaus is professor at the Freie University Berlin, and there at the Institute for China Studies. And before, he was the president of the Zeppelin universities, and also his different degrees, including his PhD, was with the Freie Universität Berlin. So Klaus, the floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Horst. Can you see the PowerPoint?
You can see it. Yeah, maybe you make it. Yeah, genau. Now it's perfect.
Okay. Very good. Is it?
No, now it's disappeared again.
Oh, I see. Okay. So I'm not sure if you can see it fully.
No, we can't see, unfortunately.
Oh,
before we saw it, but now we can't.
Okay, I see.
Maybe you open again.
Yeah. Is it working?
No, unfortunately not.
Okay. Well, then I just skipped the PowerPoint. It doesn't matter. Okay. So again, thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I want to follow up on Shenglin's excellent presentation, what he has said. I want to focus on three things. First of all, what are the main strategic shifts in the 15 5-year plan? And I will not be as detailed. There's a little repetition, but not that much. Second, my question is, what economic impacts do we have to expect, especially with the widely discussed issues of the strong focus on manufacturing? And third, I would like to put these developments into the context of Chancellor Friedrich Merz's recent visit to China and see what all this means for German companies. So when we compare the new 15th 5-year plan with the 14th 5-year plan, and Shenglin has already done a great job. Let me highlight, I think, what he has also said, that clear shift in strategic emphasis. While the 14th plan was heavily geared towards cushioning the shocks of the pandemic. Remember, that was the last time we were in the midst of the pandemic and the initial and starting geopolitical tensions. The 15th plan is a blueprint for a world that China perceives as increasingly unpredictable, and it has obviously the basic attention to make sure that China is set up, is resistant enough to deal with these unpredictabilities. Therefore, the central message is technological self-reliance and the development of a modern, highly resilient industrial system are the top priorities. Let me highlight a few specific goals and priorities. There is this focus on new qualitative productive forces. That is a term that refers to the planned innovation. And it is said that there is a spending or investment of at least 77% per year, which is significantly higher than the expected GDP growth of 4.5 to 5% that Horst has mentioned at the beginning. So I find this is quite interesting that actually a 7% investment into these new quality proactive forces, which also means actually that this area would receive much more support, over proportionally bigger support than the other areas. The second thing that is mentioned are the 6 emerging pillar industries. By 2030, China aims to grow massively in areas such as semiconductors, aerospace, biomedicine, low altitude economy, new energy storage, and intelligent robots. The target here is a production value of over 10 trillion RMB. That's 1.5 billion euros or trillion euros. Also, the plan sees that plans that artificial intelligence is set up as a cross-sectional technology. The plan envisions massive growth in this area, up to 60% annually in AI, and the introduction of a new AI plus action plan. And then another aspect we have here is industrial modernization over pure innovation. Shenglin has already referred to that. So the new plan places the modernization of the industrial manufacturing system even before technological innovation. That is really very new. And Beijing's primary concern is scaling. As you can read in the plan, it says taking the step from 1 to 100 in production technology. One sentence from the 5-year plan is particularly striking. China wants to maintain an appropriate share of manufacturing in its GDP. And this share has been dropping in recent years from 29% in 2017 to about 25% in 24. So the leadership absolutely wants to prevent a further slowing of the industrial sector following, for instance, the model that we see in America, which is often discussed under the word deindustrialization. So obviously that is to be avoided for China. Manufacturing is obviously viewed not just an economic engine, but as an irreplaceable strategic asset in today's world. So that is quite remarkable. Now, what is the expected, I think, economic impact? And obviously, this I cannot go into detail here, but let me just highlight a main factor here. If China's overall economy continues to grow and the share of industry in GDP is kept constant or even expanded, this inevitably means that industrial output must rise in the future. At the same time, China is suffering from persistent weakness in domestic demand, driven by the real estate crisis, as we know, and a high savings rate among private households. So for me, this means that although the new 5-year plan includes measures to strengthen domestic consumption, such as investments in social services like childcare, elder care, retirement, and so on, these structural reforms, for one, will take time if implemented, and they may not be enough. I think we have to expect that in the short or medium term, the discrepancy between massively subsidized, highly scaled production and weak domestic demand will continue to lead to massive export pressure. Hence, I think we have to expect that the wave of Chinese exports in high-tech and high-end markets will continue for the time being. This no longer affects only solar panels or simple consumer goods, but increasingly cars, mechanical engineering, robotics, and green technology. So the things that we import from China will also move up in the value chain. Now I come to my final point, the Merz visit and implications for German business. At the end of February, as we all know, just a few weeks ago, the German Chancellor made his inaugural visit to Beijing, accompanied by a high-ranking business delegation. The visit was atmospherically, I think, important. It signaled a political stabilization of bilateral relations after the more complicated relationship during the red-green coalition. Merz deliberately avoided the term systematic rival. I think that was received very well, emphasized the need for dialogue, which was also received very well. However important I think this is, I think we should recognize that the structural economic problems have not been addressed. They have been discussed, but I don't think there's a solution. Germany's trade deficit with China reached a new record high of 90 billion euros in 2025. So the real results of this visit for the German economy are mixed. There were no clear structural agreements on issues such as market access, state subsidies, or intellectual property protection. It was discussed, but I don't think there's not a clear plan. And as I said, we have to expect that the wave of export will continue. It was, however, and I think that's positive, agreed to relaunch regular government consultations starting in 2027. So now I come to my conclusion. What does this mean for German businesses and companies? First of all, I think the problems that we have seen in the last couple of years during the last 5-year plan will continue. There will be more competition. I think that's pretty clear. German companies must prepare for an intensified competition from China. Not only in China, but also in third markets within Europe. Second, I think in China for China becomes more important. Given this China's push for technological self-reliance and security, German companies will have to further localize their value chains in China. Those who want to participate in the Chinese markets will probably face heavy pressure to research, develop, and produce there. Certainly, de-risking remains on the agenda, as I think it will clear that companies must systematically review their supply chains. But as I totally agree with Shenglin, there are opportunities, especially in green technology and in other niches. So despite all these challenges, the opportunities are considerable, especially in transformation, industrial digitalization, smart manufacturing. I think there's still lots of areas that offer potential to cooperate. So in summary, this 5-year plan marks a transition from a strategy of pure growth to one of sharpening China's strategic and technological competitiveness. For the German economy, that means a phase of a demanding balancing act. China's innovation ecosystems and technological capabilities have improved significantly in recent years, and these advances are increasingly reflected in China's growing role in the global value chains. It's expanding its presence and its efforts to shape international technical standards. The 15th 5-year plan will continue this development. However, China's progress, also in the past, has been uneven and will probably remain uneven. Significant weaknesses will persist in several technological sectors, and Chinese policymakers, I think, have not yet fully achieved their ambitious objectives. In other words, China's technological rise is substantial, but it's neither linear nor uncontested. The reality lies somewhere between the expectations of Chinese policymakers and the concerns often voiced in German debates. So for Germany, there are mixed outcomes that apply the need for a balanced strategic approach rather than viewing technological competition with China in purely confrontational terms. And that's my main point here. Germany should strengthen its own ecosystems, invest in critical technologies, carefully calibrate economic cooperation with China. Thank you very much.